The wind of Dust Creek carried more than sand that morning. It carried judgment, every creak of the saloon doors, every clang of a hammer from the blacksmith's yard, came with murmurs that slid like knives through the narrow streets. On the far edge of town, near the corral fence, a young widow named Clara May knelt by a broken bucket, washing the dirt from her child's small boots. Her fingers were red and raw, and her gaze fixed not on the people passing by but on the ground. Where her tears could fall unseen, the townsfolk said she was cursed, that ever since her husband died in the spring flood, nothing good ever stayed near her. They spat the word widow like it meant sinner. Across the dusty road inside the general store, a tall man in a dark duster leaned against the counter. His name was Samuel Brett, a wealthy rancher whose lands stretched, beyond the ridge, thousands of acres of green that he rarely bragged about. He had money enough to buy half the town, but what he valued most was peace, and Dust Creek had very little of it. He'd come that morning to trade feed and nails, but when he looked out the window, he saw Clara May stumble beneath the taunts of two men. One yanked the pail from her hands, spilling what little water she'd carried from the well. The other laughed, a harsh, hollow sound that echoed off the wooden storefronts. Samuel's jaw tightened. He wasn't a man of many words, but injustice had a way of burning through his calm. He stepped out into the sunlight, boots sinking into dust, and the laughter faltered. "That's enough," he said, his voice steady as thunder before rain. The men shifted, muttering something about minding one's own business, but Samuel's stare silenced them. They backed away, leaving Clara trembling beside the spilled bucket. She didn't look up. She expected no kindness from anyone, least of all a man with power. He picked up the bucket, set it upright, and knelt to refill it from the barrel by the trough. "It's clean water," he murmured, handing it back to her. She hesitated, then nodded, whispering a thank you so soft the wind almost stole it. Samuel tipped his hat and walked away, but the sight of her haunted him long after he returned to his ranch. That night the moon hung low and red above the hills. Samuel sat by his window, watching the lanterns flicker in town, wondering how long that woman had endured such cruelty. He remembered her husband, a miner, honest and poor, who'd drowned trying to save others during the flood. The town had mourned him for a week, maybe two, before turning its pity into scorn for the wife he'd left behind. Samuel could never understand that kind of coldness. Days turned into weeks. Each time he rode through town, he saw Clara again, sometimes sweeping outside the tailor's shop, sometimes carrying heavy sacks for a storekeeper too lazy to help. Her face was always tired, yet there was something unbroken in her eyes, a quiet defiance that even humiliation couldn't kill. And every day someone found a reason to mock her. It was as if the town needed a victim to feel righteous. One afternoon, a storm rolled over the plains, dark and fast. Samuel was driving his herd toward shelter when he saw a figure running through the rain, a woman clutching a child to her chest, stumbling over the muddy road. Lightning flashed, and he recognized her instantly. Without thinking, he dismounted and ran toward her. "Clara!" he shouted above the wind. She turned, soaked and shaking, her lips pale with cold. The child, and her son barely 4 in, was crying, his small hands gripping her torn shawl. Samuel lifted them both onto his horse and guided them toward an abandoned barn nearby. The roof leaked, but it was dry enough to breathe and speak. He built a fire from broken boards, the flame painting gold across their faces. For the first time, Clara met his eyes directly. "You shouldn't have helped me," she whispered. "They'll talk." "Let them talk," Samuel said quietly. "They've been talking for too long." The silence that followed was thick with rain and unspoken pain. She told him about the landlord who doubled her rent, about the shopkeeper who shorted her pay, about the sheriff who turned away each time she begged for fairness. Samuel listened, not as a rescuer, but as a man who finally saw the cost of silence. When the storm passed, he rode them home to the edge of town. The sun broke through the clouds, casting light over the wet earth. Clara looked at the horizon, then at Samuel. "You don't owe me anything," she said softly. He smiled faintly. "Maybe not. But this world would be less of a burden if more of us owed each other kindness." That was the day the whispers changed tone. People saw them together, the rich rancher and the outcast widow, and tongues wagged faster than before. But Samuel didn't care. He'd spent years building fences and fortunes. Now he found himself building courage instead. Back at his ranch, he couldn't sleep. Every gust of wind outside sounded like the voices in town, sneering, judging. He knew helping her once wouldn't change anything. To truly protect her, he'd have to do more than offer sympathy. He'd have to make her untouchable. The next morning, he saddled his horse at dawn and rode straight into town. Dust rose behind him like smoke, and the people turned as he passed. He stopped in front of the church where the preacher was sweeping the steps. "Reverend," Samuel said, dismounting, "I need you to witness something soon. A promise." The preacher blinked. "A promise of what kind?" Samuel looked toward the far end of the street, where Clara stood outside the laundry, hanging clothes in the early light, the kind that'll stop this town from ever laying a hand on her again. And so began a story that would test both their hearts, the pride of a man who'd sworn never to love again, and the strength of a woman who'd forgotten what love even felt like.